Part 1. Before the Romans. The prosperity of native Britain. Before the Romans arrived, Britain was far from the primitive and isolated land that many Roman writers later described. It was a thriving island with its own complex economy, social hierarchy, and far-reaching trade connections. The Britons lived in organized tribal societies that had developed efficient systems of agriculture, craftsmanship, and commerce long before Roman influence reached their shores. The population of pre-Roman Britain consisted of various Celtic tribes, each with its own territory, customs, and ruling elite. These tribes were not unified under one government, but they shared cultural similarities, and often engaged in both cooperation and rivalry. Despite their differences, they had something remarkable in common: a stable and growing economic foundation. Agriculture formed the backbone of the native British economy. The people cultivated wheat, barley, oats, and rye, using iron plows that allowed them to manage large tracts of farmland. Livestock was equally important. Cattle, sheep, and pigs not only provided food, but also served as symbols of wealth and status. Rural settlements were strategically located near rivers and trade routes, and surplus crops were traded between tribes or stored for future use. In addition to farming, Britain was rich in natural resources. Tin from Cornwall, lead from the Mende Pills, and iron from the Weald were all extracted and traded. These resources were crucial in the wider European economy. British tin, in particular, was highly valued across the continent because it was essential for making bronze, which remained a core material for weapons, tools, and decorative items. By the 1st century BCE, Britain had already become a known supplier of metals to merchants from Gaul and beyond. Trade extended far beyond the island's shores. Archaeological discoveries show that British tribes traded actively with continental Europe, especially with the Gauls, who acted as middlemen between Britain and the Mediterranean world. British goods such as metals, hides, slaves, and hunting dogs were exchanged for Roman wine, glassware, fine pottery, and jewelry. This exchange not only enriched certain tribes, but also exposed them to new cultural influences. Long before conquest, Rome's presence was felt through commerce. The British tribes also demonstrated advanced craftsmanship. Local artisans were skilled in metalwork, weaving, and pottery production. They created intricate gold torques, decorative brooches, and high-quality iron tools. Their craftsmanship reflected both artistic sophistication and economic strength. These artisans played a crucial role in tribal economies, supplying goods for domestic use, trade, and ceremonial purposes. One of the most telling signs of economic development was the production of coinage. By the 1st century BCE, several tribes, particularly in the southeast, had begun minting their own coins. These coins were often inspired by Gaulish and Roman designs, but quickly evolved into uniquely British forms, decorated with symbols of local identity such as horses, chariots, and tribal emblems. Coins served as both currency and propaganda, a means of asserting political control and economic independence. Their circulation shows that Britain had already developed a level of monetary sophistication before Roman rule. The structure of the tribal economy encouraged local specialization. Coastal tribes thrived on fishing and maritime trade, while inland tribes focused on farming and metal extraction. Certain regions became known for specific resources, and this natural specialization fostered an intertribal trade network that bound the island together economically. There were even proto-urban settlements, large fortified centers known as oppida, that acted as hubs of administration, craftsmanship, and commerce. These oppida, such as those at Colchester and St. Albans, predated Roman towns and served similar economic purposes. Socially, the economy supported a hierarchical system. At the top were the tribal elites, kings, queens, and chieftains, who controlled land and trade. They benefited the most from commerce with the continent, accumulating luxury imports that reinforced their power and prestige. Below them were craftsmen, traders, and farmers who formed the backbone of daily production. Even though wealth was unevenly distributed, the society as a whole functioned in a relatively balanced way, with each level depending on the other. Religious practices were also intertwined with the economy. The Druids, who held immense spiritual and intellectual authority, influenced economic decisions through rituals and festivals that aligned with the agricultural calendar. Seasonal celebrations marked harvests, trade fairs, and the redistribution of resources. This fusion of economy and religion helped maintain order and continuity across the generations. Politically, economic power translated directly into military strength. Tribes with more resources could afford better weapons, larger armies, and more fortified settlements. The flow of wealth through trade and tribute allowed certain rulers, like the powerful Cunobelinus of the Catuvellauni, to dominate neighboring tribes. These regional powerhouses were beginning to form what could have become small kingdoms, setting the stage for both cooperation and confrontation when Rome arrived. By the time Julius Caesar made his first expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, the island was already deeply tied to continental trade networks. Caesar himself noted that British merchants were familiar with Roman goods, and that the tribes were far more advanced than many in Gaul had expected. What the Romans saw was not a barbaric frontier, but an economically functioning society, one that was rich in minerals, fertile in land, and filled with opportunities for exploitation. Yet this prosperity was also Britain's vulnerability. Its abundance of resources and its fragmented tribal system made it an appealing target for the Roman Empire. The wealth that had made the island strong also made it desirable to outsiders. The Romans understood this immediately. To them, Britain was not just a territory to conquer, it was a market to control, a treasury of raw materials, and a population to tax. Before the Roman conquest, the Britons lived in an economy that, while simple by imperial standards, was efficient, independent, and sustainable. They were self-reliant, connected to their environment, and capable of managing their own trade and production. The coming of Rome would change all of that. What was once a system built on local balance would soon be replaced by imperial exploitation, taxation, and economic dependency. The conquest of Britain would not only redraw its political boundaries, but also dismantle the very foundation of its economy. The Romans would introduce new roads, towns, and currencies, but beneath the surface, these improvements would serve one purpose: to extract wealth from the island and feed the empire's insatiable demand. The next part of this series explores how the invasion began and how Rome's first acts on British soil were not of civilization, but of plunder. Part 2. The conquest begins. Loot, tribute, and the economic takeover. When the Roman legions landed on British shores in 43 CE under Emperor Claudius, the invasion was framed as a civilizing mission, an act of bringing order and progress to a so-called barbaric land. But beneath this noble disguise, Rome's campaign was driven by one motive above all others: economic gain. The conquest of Britain was not just a military operation, it was an economic extraction project on a massive scale. To understand how Rome economically damaged the Britons, we must first look at what happened during the invasion itself. Roman warfare was designed to strip a land of its wealth long before permanent control was even established. Every campaign began with plunder. Towns were sacked, sacred sites looted, and captives taken and sold as slaves. The invading forces moved through the countryside, not only to secure territory, but to seize livestock, grain, and valuables. For the Roman generals, this was both strategy and incentive. Loot was a form of payment for soldiers and proof of victory for commanders seeking political prestige back in Rome. When Claudius launched the full-scale conquest, he promised the Senate glory, but he promised his legions gold. The wealth of Britain became both the cause and the reward of conquest. The early campaigns devastated local economies. Farmlands were burned, harvests destroyed, and trade routes disrupted. The Roman army, numbering tens of thousands, consumed vast amounts of food and supplies. To feed themselves, they confiscated crops and animals from local tribes, often without payment. Villages that resisted were annihilated. The Britons, who had once traded freely with the continent, now found themselves supplying an occupying force that gave nothing in return. Once the initial resistance was crushed, Rome began the process of systematic extraction. Tribute was imposed on defeated tribes, regular payments in gold, silver, grain, and slaves. These tributes were not symbolic. They were enormous, deliberately set to weaken native economies and make rebellion impossible. By forcing the Britons to surrender a portion of their resources year after year, Rome ensured that wealth flowed in one direction, from Britain to the empire's treasury. In regions where resistance persisted, economic punishment was even harsher. Crops were destroyed, and the population was forced into submission through starvation. Roman generals knew that an impoverished population was easier to control. The destruction of self-sufficiency was a weapon in itself. At the same time, Rome began to seize land. Vast estates were confiscated from native chieftains and redistributed to Roman veterans, governors, and loyal collaborators. These estates, called latifundia, became centers of production dedicated to feeding the Roman army and exporting goods back to the continent. The Britons, who once owned and farmed these lands, were often reduced to laborers or tenants. Within a single generation, much of Britain's fertile soil had passed into Roman hands. Taxation soon followed. Even before full Roman administration was established, governors began collecting tribute disguised as tax. Every tribe, village, and household was assessed for what it could pay. The Romans recorded population numbers, livestock counts, and harvest yields, not for planning, but for profit. The conquered Britons now worked partly for themselves and partly for Rome. The psychological impact of this system was immense. The Britons had lived in economies built on reciprocity, systems where trade and obligation flowed both ways. Rome replaced this with a one-sided system of exploitation. The Britons provided food, metals, and labor. Rome provided domination, laws, and taxes. The sense of local independence that had sustained tribal economies began to vanish. The construction of Roman forts and roads, often praised as signs of progress, was also part of this extraction network. Roads were not built to connect British communities. They were built to move soldiers, tax collectors, and goods efficiently toward ports and garrisons. Every Roman road was a vein through which Britain's wealth was drained. Within a few decades, the island's most resource-rich regions had been transformed into zones of heavy exploitation. In the south and west, mines for lead and tin were placed under direct imperial control. These mines became state monopolies, their output shipped to the continent to supply Rome's military and construction industries. Local laborers worked under brutal conditions, often enslaved or forced to pay their taxes and physical labor. The invasion also disrupted existing trade networks. The tribal trading system that once linked communities across the island collapsed under the weight of Roman control. Native markets were replaced by Roman towns where commerce favored imperial goods and Roman currency. The local barter economy disappeared, replaced by coin-based trade that only Rome could regulate. This shift seemed like modernization, but in reality, it stripped the Britons of economic autonomy. The conquest further deepened the gap between the elites and the common people. Certain tribal leaders, realizing resistance was futile, sided with the Romans. They retained limited power in exchange for enforcing Roman taxes and supplying resources. These collaborators benefited in the short term, gaining access to Roman goods and status, but they did so at the expense of their people. Tribal solidarity eroded as local rulers became agents of Roman authority. Perhaps the most devastating consequence of the conquest was the loss of self-determination. The British economy, once independent and decentralized, now revolved around the needs of a foreign empire. Agriculture shifted focus from local consumption to imperial supply. The grain that once fed British families was now being exported to feed Roman soldiers. Mines that had once enriched local tribes now filled Roman treasuries. And the labor that built Roman towns and villas came from the very people whose livelihoods had been destroyed. The Romans often portrayed themselves as bringers of civilization. They pointed to their cities, roads, and public baths as proof of progress. But behind the marble and stone lay the suffering of a conquered people. Every temple built to honor Roman gods, every amphitheater erected for entertainment, was paid for by British taxes and labor. For the Britons, civilization came at the price of freedom and prosperity. By the end of the 1st century CE, the economic landscape of Britain had changed forever. The once self-sustaining tribal economies had been dismantled, replaced by an imperial system built on exploitation. The wealth that had once circulated within the island now flowed steadily across the channel into the coffers of Rome. This was only the beginning. As Roman administration expanded, taxation would grow heavier, mining more intensive, and control more absolute. The next stage of occupation would not only drain Britain's wealth, but enslave its economy in perpetuity. In the next part, we'll uncover how the Roman taxation system turned daily life in Britain into a constant struggle for survival, and how the empire's hunger for revenue left the island's people trapped in poverty and dependence. Part 3. The Tax Chains. How Roman taxation bled the Britons. After Rome had secured its military grip on Britain, the empire moved swiftly to secure something far more valuable: revenue. Conquest was only the first step. The true purpose of empire was profit, and profit came through taxation. For the Britons, this marked the beginning of an economic system that would bleed them slowly for nearly 4 centuries. Roman taxation was not merely a financial obligation, it was a tool of control. By making conquered peoples pay for their own occupation, the empire ensured that its provinces funded both their subjugation and the machinery that kept them oppressed. Britain was no exception. The province became a vital source of wealth for Rome, not just in metals and crops, but in the steady stream of tax revenue extracted from its people. The Roman tax system was complex, calculated, and ruthless. Every person, every field, every animal was assessed for its potential to yield income for the state. Upon conquest, surveyors known as censitores were dispatched to map the land and estimate its value. The survey, called the census, determined exactly how much each region, tribe, or individual was expected to contribute. From this point onward, nothing in Britain was free, not even the land that Britons had farmed for generations. There were two main forms of taxation, tributum soli and tributum capitis, land tax and poll tax. The land tax was levied on farms, fields, and estates, calculated according to their productivity. Even small farmers, barely growing enough to feed their families, were expected to surrender a portion of their harvest to the state. The poll tax applied to individuals, a fixed sum that had to be paid in Roman currency, a deliberate move that forced Britons into Rome's monetary economy. Those who could not pay in coins were often required to work off their debt through labor or service. For ordinary Britons, taxation was not an annual inconvenience. It was a constant pressure. Roman officials and tax collectors operated year-round, demanding grain, livestock, wool, and metal in addition to money. Tax burdens varied across the province, but in some areas they were so heavy that local economies collapsed entirely. Villagers were forced to sell their possessions, abandon their land, or enter into debt bondage simply to meet the empire's demands. The Roman governors in Britain were not simply administrators, they were revenue managers. Their success in career advancement in Rome depended on how efficiently they could extract wealth from the province. Corruption was rampant. Many governors enriched themselves by inflating tax assessments, accepting bribes, and using soldiers to enforce compliance. The line between legal taxation and outright extortion was often indistinguishable. The empire's obsession with taxation went far beyond money. The collection process itself was designed to reinforce domination. Every census, every audit, every record of payment reminded the Britons that their land, labor, and lives belonged to Rome. Those who failed to pay were punished harshly, their property confiscated, their families enslaved, or their villages burned as an example to others. Resistance was futile. Even minor uprisings were crushed under the weight of Roman legions. Of the most infamous examples of this exploitation can be found in the revolt led by Queen Boudica in 60 CE. Her uprising was sparked in part by economic abuse. After the death of her husband, King Prasutagus of the Iceni, Roman officials seized his lands and demanded repayment of so-called debts owed to the empire. The Iceni were stripped of their property, their nobles flogged, and their women violated. Boudica's rebellion was as much an economic revolt as it was a political one, a desperate reaction to the unbearable weight of Roman greed. Even after the rebellion was crushed, the taxation system only grew more sophisticated. Under Emperor Hadrian, a network of tax offices was established throughout the province, connected by the famous Roman roads. Inspectors monitored markets and ports, ensuring that trade tariffs and customs duties were collected efficiently. Britain was no longer just a conquered land. It was an administrative machine for funneling wealth into Rome's imperial treasury. The Romans justified their taxes by claiming they provided protection, order, and infrastructure. And to some extent they did. Roads, forts, and towns were maintained using tax funds, and a small fraction of the population, usually Roman settlers or loyal elites, benefited from these developments. But for the majority of Britons, taxes funded nothing but oppression. The Roman peace they paid for was a peace that existed only for their conquerors. The economic effects of the system were devastating. Small farmers were the hardest hit. Many lost their land due to unpaid taxes and were forced to work on large estates owned by Roman citizens or local collaborators. These estates, often managed by absentee landlords, produced crops for export rather than local consumption. Grain that had once fed British families now filled Roman ships bound for the continent. Taxation also destroyed the independence of local communities. Tribal leaders who once held economic power were reduced to tax intermediaries, middlemen responsible for collecting and forwarding revenue to Roman authorities. This weakened traditional leadership structures and tied local elites directly to the empire's financial system. Loyalty was no longer to the tribe, but to the tax office. Over time, the constant extraction of resources created deep economic inequality. Roman citizens and officials in Britain grew wealthy from taxation, while the native population sank further into poverty. In towns like Londinium and Verulamium, luxurious villas and markets stood as symbols of Roman prosperity, built, ironically, on the taxes of those who could never afford to enter them. By the 3rd century, the burden had become unsustainable. Periodic rebellions and economic crises forced Rome to increase taxes even further, as the empire struggled to fund its massive military and bureaucracy. The Britons, already impoverished, were squeezed dry. Many abandoned their farms altogether, retreating to less accessible regions to escape the reach of Roman tax collectors. The once productive province began to show signs of decay. The taxation system did more than take money. It eroded the very foundation of Britain's economy. Self-sufficiency disappeared, replaced by dependence on Roman markets and administrators. Native industries declined as labor was redirected toward meeting tax obligations. Over generations, the Britons lost the economic freedom their ancestors had once enjoyed. What Rome called order and civilization was, in reality, a carefully engineered system of economic enslavement. Every field tilled, every mine worked, and every coin minted in Britain served the empire's appetite, not the people's well-being. The taxes were the chains that kept Britain bound to Rome, invisible but unbreakable. When we look at Roman Britain through this lens, we see not a story of progress, but of plunder disguised as policy. The empire's roads, towns, and villas were built on the backs of those who paid endlessly for their own subjugation. But taxation was only one part of Rome's exploitation. Beyond taxes lay an even deeper wound, the systematic extraction of Britain's natural wealth. The mines, forests, and fields became imperial property, drained year after year until little remained for the Britons themselves. In the next part, we'll explore how Rome turned Britain into a resource mine, and how centuries of imperial extraction stripped the island of its riches, its independence, and its future. Part 4. Extraction Empire. Britain as Rome's resource. Mine once. Rome had established its political and military control over Britain. It turned its attention to the province's greatest prize, its natural resources. To the empire, Britain was not simply another conquest. It was a storehouse of materials waiting to be exploited. The fertile fields, dense forests, and mineral-rich hills of the island became the raw fuel for Rome's economy. The Roman Empire thrived on extraction. Its provinces were not designed to prosper independently, but to supply the imperial core with the wealth and materials it needed to sustain itself. Every newly conquered land was assessed for what it could produce, and Britain was no exception. Its abundance of minerals, agricultural land, and manpower made it one of the most economically valuable regions in the Western Empire. The most immediate target was mining. Britain's subsoil held enormous deposits of lead, tin, iron, and silver. The Romans wasted no time in claiming these resources. Within a few years of conquest, imperial engineers and soldiers had occupied key mining regions across the island. The lead mines of the Mendip Hills, the tin mines of Cornwall, the gold fields of Wales, and the ironworks of the Weald were all brought under direct Roman control. Mining operations were organized on an industrial scale. Roman technology, including water-powered drainage wheels and furnaces, transformed these sites into centers of mass production. But this progress came at a terrible cost to the Britons. The mines were worked largely by forced labor. Convicts, slaves, and local inhabitants conscripted to meet imperial quotas. Conditions were brutal. Workers spent long hours underground, inhaling toxic fumes and enduring constant danger from cave-ins and flooding. Many never survived long enough to see freedom. The lead extracted from British mines was particularly valuable. It was used in plumbing systems, roofing, pipes, and even in Roman cosmetics. Thousands of tons of British lead were shipped each year to the continent, stamped with imperial marks that declared it property of the Roman state. Archaeological evidence shows that lead ingots produced in Britain have been found as far away as Germany and Italy. Proof of just how heavily the province's resources were drained. Tin, too, was a major export. Before the conquest, the Cornish tin trade had been a thriving native industry connected to continental networks. Under Rome, it became a state monopoly. Private trade was outlawed. Only imperial agents could mine, refine, and export tin. The profits no longer went to local tribes or merchants. They flowed directly to Rome's treasury. Agriculture was also transformed. The Romans reorganized the countryside into a system of villi, large agricultural estates owned by Roman citizens and loyal Britons who had aligned themselves with the empire. These estates were highly efficient and used advanced farming techniques, but they were focused on imperial needs, not local ones. Crops such as wheat, barley, and flax were produced in massive quantities, much of it exported to feed the Roman army or sent to other provinces. The rural population, now tenants or laborers on lands they once owned, had little control over what they produced or where it went. Forests were cleared to make way for farming and fuel for smelting operations. Ironworks required enormous amounts of charcoal, leading to widespread deforestation in parts of southern Britain. Rivers were diverted to power mills and transport ore, altering ecosystems that had supported local communities for centuries. The environmental cost of Roman extraction was immense, a silent destruction that paralleled the economic one. Even Britain's people became a resource. Thousands were enslaved and sent abroad to work in Roman households, farms, and mines. Others were conscripted into the Roman army, serving far from home in distant provinces. The loss of population, especially of young, able-bodied men, weakened local economies and communities. Britain was being hollowed out from within. Rome's control over trade further deepened this exploitation. The empire imposed heavy customs duties on goods entering and leaving the province. Native merchants were pushed aside in favor of Roman traders who monopolized key markets. The ports of Londinium, Richborough, and Chester became conduits for extraction, vast warehouses where British resources were loaded onto ships bound for the continent. For every ton of metal or grain exported, taxes and tariffs enriched the imperial treasury. To many Britons, it must have seemed that everything of value was leaving the island. Even as Roman towns grew and roads multiplied, the wealth they generated did not circulate among the people. Instead, it flowed outward, across the channel to the empire's financial centers. The more Rome developed Britain's infrastructure, the more efficiently it could strip the island of its riches. Roman propaganda portrayed this extraction as progress. The empire claimed it was bringing technology, order, and civilization to a backward land. To some local elites, this appeared true. Roman goods filled the markets, new towns flourished, and trade routes expanded. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, the native population grew poorer. The wealth they produced was not reinvested in Britain. It was consumed by an empire that saw the province only as a means to its own survival. By the 2nd century CE, the economic structure of Britain had been completely transformed. The island had shifted from a network of independent tribes and small-scale producers to a colony feeding the demands of a distant capital. Local economies were distorted to serve imperial priorities. Regions rich in minerals became centers of extraction. Fertile areas became zones of agricultural production. The Britons themselves had become subjects in a vast machine whose purpose was not to sustain them, but to sustain Rome. This system had long-term consequences. The dependence on imperial infrastructure made Britain vulnerable. Roads, ports, and supply chains that once moved goods efficiently also ensured that when Rome withdrew, the economy would collapse. The native industries that had sustained the island before conquest had been replaced by imperial ones that could not function without Roman oversight. Britain had been reshaped into a resource colony, productive only as long as Rome controlled it. For nearly 4 centuries, this arrangement endured. Britain supplied metals, grain, wool, and soldiers to the empire, receiving in return the illusion of stability. But as the empire's strength began to wane, so too did its grip on the island. The mines slowed, trade routes faltered, and the economy began to fracture. What had once been a steady flow of wealth outward became a vacuum, drawing the province into decline. Rome's extraction of Britain's resources was not just an economic act, it was an erasure. It destroyed the self-sustaining systems that had defined the island before conquest, replacing them with dependency and depletion. The empire left behind roads, walls, and ruins, but it took with it the wealth of a nation. In the next part, we'll examine how this extraction went beyond materials and labor, how Rome rewired Britain's culture, currency, and identity to create total economic dependence, ensuring that even after centuries, the Britons could no longer imagine life outside the empire's shadow. Part 5. Cultural and economic dependency. The Romanization. Trapped when historians speak of Romanization, they often describe it as a civilizing process, the spread of Roman culture, language, and lifestyle into conquered territories. But beneath the elegant mosaics and Latin inscriptions, Romanization was a form of control. It was a strategy designed not just to conquer bodies, but minds, to reshape conquered peoples into willing participants in their own exploitation. In Britain, this process was especially deep. The Romans didn't only take the land, they redefined what it meant to live on it. They replaced tribal systems of trade, governance, and belief with institutions modeled after Rome itself. Towns, currency, architecture, and even fashion were redesigned to align with the empire's identity. To many Britons, this new way of life must have seemed sophisticated, even superior. Yet behind the facade of civilization was a mechanism that bound the island economically and psychologically to its conquerors. At the center of Romanization was urbanization. The Romans built towns not merely as settlements, but as instruments of administration and taxation. Londinium, Verulamium, Camulodunum, these were not just places where people lived. They were hubs of imperial order. Inside their walls, Roman officials collected taxes, regulated trade, and enforced laws. The towns functioned like arteries through which the empire could extract wealth efficiently and maintain surveillance over its subjects. The architecture of these towns symbolized power. Forms, basilicas, and bathhouses displayed Rome's grandeur and reminded local populations of who ruled them. The presence of temples dedicated to the emperor blurred the line between governance and worship, subtly conditioning Britons to associate prosperity with obedience to Rome. In economic terms, towns became centers of consumption, importing goods from the continent while exporting local resources. This created a one-way flow of value. Britain bought Roman luxuries with the wealth extracted from its own soil. Currency played a vital role in deepening dependence. Before Rome, much of Britain's economy operated on barter or tribal coinage. The Romans replaced these systems with imperial currency, minted under the emperor's authority. It was not just money, it was propaganda. Every coin bore the emperor's face, a daily reminder of who controlled the economy. This new currency system tied Britain directly into the Roman economic network. Taxes had to be paid in Roman coin. Soldiers were paid in it. Merchants used it for trade. Over time, the native Britons lost their economic autonomy. They could no longer operate outside the imperial system. Even local rulers who cooperated with Rome found themselves financially trapped. Their wealth existed only as long as the empire allowed it to. Trade patterns reinforced this dependency. Britain became a consumer of Roman goods, fine pottery, glassware, olive oil, and wine, all imported from abroad. These luxuries were symbols of status, and local elites eagerly embraced them to show their loyalty and refinement. The more they indulged in Roman goods, the more dependent they became on the imperial economy. Wealth was no longer measured in local production, but in proximity to Roman culture. This cultural shift had far-reaching effects. Tribal craftsmanship, once central to the British identity, declined sharply. Traditional pottery, metalwork, and textiles were replaced by imported alternatives. The skills that had sustained local economies for centuries were eroded by Roman mass production and monopolized trade. Native artisans either adapted to serve Roman tastes or faded into obscurity. The social hierarchy was also transformed. The Romans elevated a class of collaborators, local chieftains, traders, and landowners who benefited from Roman rule. These elites were rewarded with citizenship, tax privileges, and influence, but their loyalty came at a price. They became intermediaries between the conquerors and the conquered, enforcing the very system that exploited their people. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. For the first time in British history, a small minority lived in villas, surrounded by luxury, while the rural masses struggled under taxation and forced labor. Taxation itself became a powerful tool of control. Every aspect of life carried a cost: land, produce, livestock, even labor. Taxes were collected in coin, which meant Britons had to engage with the imperial economy to survive. Those who couldn't pay lost their property or were forced into debt bondage. The tax system ensured that economic dependency was not optional. It was mandatory. Religion played its part as well. The Roman state promoted the worship of its gods and emperors, often blending them with local deities to make the transition smoother. Temples dedicated to the imperial cult became symbols of loyalty. Religious festivals celebrated Rome's victories, not Britain's heritage. Even spirituality was co-opted into the machinery of economic and political submission. Education, too, became a form of indoctrination. Latin was the language of administration and commerce. To succeed, Britons had to learn it. Over generations, this linguistic shift distanced people from their traditions and replaced them with Roman ideals. To think in Latin was, in a sense, to think like Rome. The more the Britons adopted Roman customs, the harder it became to imagine life without the empire. All of this, the towns, the money, the taxes, the religion, created what can only be described as an economic illusion. On the surface, Britain appeared to prosper. Roads were built, cities expanded, trade flourished. But this prosperity was uneven and extractive. The benefits were concentrated among the Romanized elite, while the majority of Britons bore the cost. It was a system that enriched a few at the expense of many, and kept the entire island tethered to an external power. Even the Roman military presence reinforced this dependency. The legions stationed in Britain consumed enormous resources: food, housing, materials, all supplied by local economies. The province existed in part to sustain the army that occupied it. And when soldiers were paid, their wages circulated through local markets, creating a deceptive sense of wealth. But it was circular. Money came from Rome, was spent in Britain, and ultimately returned to Rome through taxes and trade. By the 3rd century, the Romanization of Britain was nearly complete. Latin inscriptions marked milestones and gravestones. Roman gods stood where Celtic shrines once had. Economically and culturally, the island was indistinguishable from any other Roman province. Yet beneath this assimilation lay fragility. Rome had woven itself so tightly into Britain's identity that when the empire began to decline, the province had no foundation of its own to fall back on. When the legions eventually withdrew in the early 5th century, the illusion of civilization collapsed almost overnight. The currency lost its value. Trade networks disintegrated. Towns were abandoned. The elites who had depended on Roman systems found themselves powerless. For centuries, Britain had been trained to rely on Rome, and when Rome disappeared, the province's economy imploded. The Romanization of Britain was, in essence, a psychological conquest. The empire didn't just drain Britain's resources, it rewired the way Britons thought about wealth, power, and identity. By the time the Romans left, Britain was no longer the land it had been. It was a hollowed shell of its former self, a province that had traded independence for imitation. In the final part of this series, we'll explore the aftermath, how Rome's departure left behind economic chaos, social collapse, and a fractured legacy that would shape Britain for centuries to come. Part 6, Aftermath, the collapse and legacy of Roman economic rule in Britain. When the Roman legions finally departed Britain in the early 5th century, they left behind more than ruins. They left an economy that had been engineered to serve an empire and could not survive without it. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been molded into a cog within Rome's vast machine. Once that machine stopped turning, the island was left stranded, stripped of its old systems and unprepared to sustain itself. The collapse was not sudden, but it was total. At first, local leaders tried to maintain the illusion of order. Former Roman officials and landowners attempted to keep towns functioning, taxes collected, and trade flowing. But without the legions to protect trade routes and ports, piracy and raids quickly disrupted commerce. The Roman road system, once the arteries of imperial extraction, became dangerous pathways haunted by bandits. The towns that had symbolized Roman civilization turned into ghostly shells, their markets empty and their forms silent. Britain's economy, once interwoven with Rome's, now found itself cut off. The imperial coinage that had dominated trade began to vanish. With no new coins arriving from the continent, money lost its meaning. People reverted to barter, trading goods directly once again, just as their ancestors had done before the Romans came. But this was not a return to the old Celtic prosperity. The skills, crafts, and systems that had once supported local economies were gone. Romanization had erased them. Agriculture suffered next. The great villa estates that had produced food for Rome fell into decay. Their owners fled, died, or lost their power without imperial backing. The laborers who had once worked those fields were left without direction, struggling to survive amid crumbling infrastructure. Irrigation systems failed. Warehouses rotted. The surplus that had fed the army and the towns disappeared. Britain, once an exporter of grain, now faced hunger. The mining industry, once the crown jewel of Rome's exploitation, also collapsed. Without the organization and technology of the empire, the complex network of mines and smelters fell silent. The knowledge of how to operate them was lost to time. The Britons, who had been forced to work under Roman engineers for generations, had never been allowed to control the process. Now, with Rome gone, the mines flooded, the furnaces went cold, and the wealth beneath the ground remained unreachable. Trade routes disintegrated. The ports that had connected Britain to Gaul and Spain were abandoned as foreign merchants stopped arriving. The luxuries that once symbolized Roman refinement, olive oil, wine, glassware, disappeared from markets. The economy shrank inward, isolated and fragmented. Without Rome, Britain was no longer a participant in a continental system. It had become an island again, both geographically and economically. But the most profound loss was not material, it was structural. For centuries, Britain's economy had been centralized and hierarchical, managed by governors, tax collectors, and imperial merchants. The Romans had replaced local institutions with imperial ones. Now, with those gone, nothing remained to take their place. Power fractured among dozens of petty kingdoms and warlords, each struggling to control what little was left. Without a unified currency, taxation system, or military, economic stability was impossible. Archaeological evidence paints a bleak picture of this transition. Roman towns show signs of abandonment. Once paved streets covered in debris, public baths repurposed as animal pens, grand villas stripped for stone. Inscriptions and coins stop appearing after the early 5th century. The literacy that had spread through Roman schools faded. Britain entered a dark age, not because of ignorance, but because the very systems that had once organized society had disintegrated. Yet, paradoxically, the seeds of a new order were sown in this collapse. Freed from direct Roman taxation and administration, local communities slowly began to rebuild, drawing on fragments of both Celtic and Roman traditions. The economy returned to small-scale farming, local trade, and self-sufficiency. In some regions, people reused Roman coins and artifacts not as currency, but as relics of prestige, symbols of a lost world. Still, the shadow of Rome lingered. Its economic scars shaped Britain's development for centuries. The concept of centralized taxation, estate-based agriculture, and hierarchical governance, all Roman imports, would resurface in the medieval feudal system. Even the idea of urban administration, of cities as centers of power, persisted in places like London, which survived precisely because it had once been Roman. But for the generations who lived through the aftermath, there was no glory in this inheritance. They lived amid the ruins of an empire that had once promised civilization and left only poverty. To them, Roman roads were reminders of conquest, Roman villas of inequality, and Roman coins of a world that no longer existed. Some historians argue that the fall of Roman Britain was inevitable, that an economy built on extraction and dependence could not survive without its master. Others see it as a tragedy of transformation, where a vibrant island was molded into a colony and then abandoned when it no longer served its purpose. Whatever the interpretation, the result was the same: economic devastation and cultural amnesia. By the time the Saxons arrived from across the sea, Britain was vulnerable. The island that had once sent metals and soldiers to Rome could barely defend itself. The collapse of the Roman economy had left the population weakened, divided, and desperate. The new invaders encountered little organized resistance, only scattered remnants of a society still haunted by its imperial past. And yet, even in ruin, Rome's legacy endured. Its roads guided new settlers, its walls sheltered new rulers. The Britons, though impoverished, inherited fragments of Roman knowledge, engineering, law, and language that would eventually resurface in future centuries. In a strange twist of history, the empire that had once drained Britain of wealth had also planted the seeds of its eventual rebirth, but the price was steep. For nearly 400 years, Rome had treated Britain as a source, not a society, a place to be mined, taxed, and reshaped for foreign benefit. When that system finally collapsed, it took with it centuries of economic and social development. The island's future would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. The story of Roman Britain is therefore not just one of conquest and civilization. It's a cautionary tale about dependency, about how even the most advanced systems can crumble when they are built on exploitation rather than empowerment. Rome gave Britain roads, walls, and cities, but it also gave it fragility. When the empire fell, Britain learned the hardest truth of all, that prosperity built for someone else is not prosperity at all.